Provoking a close and historically friendly ally into such an extreme response was another. Critics of the administration quickly pounced. Economic think tanks released reports detailing how the tariffs, far from protecting American workers, were now contributing to job losses due to retaliatory measures. The agriculture sector, which relies heavily on exports to Canada, began reporting canceled orders and falling prices. The irony was not lost on many that a policy designed to punish foreign competitors was now hurting American farmers, truckers, and small businesses. Within Canada, the decision to restrict U.S. access to Alaska was not without risk. Critics warned that it could backfire, pushing the U.S. to double down on its protectionist policies. There were fears that the United States might retaliate in other ways, by restricting Canadian flights over American airspace or limiting cross-border financial transactions. However, the Canadian government calculated that a firm response would earn them more leverage in any future negotiations. Meanwhile, U.S. allies abroad began reassessing their own strategies. If Canada could be subjected to sudden tariffs and responded with such a bold move, what did that imply for other nations with vital relationships with the United States? Confidence in the reliability of U.S. foreign policy began to erode, and some trade negotiations were quietly paused as other countries waited to see how the standoff would unfold. On the ground in Alaska, the disruption became part of everyday conversation. Local news broadcasts tracked the status of supply deliveries like weather updates. Community leaders organized support networks for those most affected by shortages. Some residents even began driving to ports for access to goods that had once arrived effortlessly by truck. The sense of isolation, already a feature of life in the far north, deepened. For many Alaskans, it became a moment of reckoning about the state's vulnerability and the importance of its geopolitical placement. In Washington and Ottawa alike, teams of negotiators worked behind the scenes to assess off-ramps. Proposals ranged from partial tariff rollbacks to a phased reopening of transit corridors. However, the political cost of appearing weak before domestic audiences made any rapid resolution difficult. Both Trump and Canadian Prime Minister officials faced pressure to stand firm, even as economic and logistical damage accumulated. The broader philosophical question about the relationship between economic policy and national unity hovered in the background. Was the assertion of sovereignty through tariffs worth the price of regional disruption and international strain? Could a world power afford to alienate even its closest allies in pursuit of economic realignment? And at what point would the economic consequences outpace any potential political gain? These questions remained unanswered as the borders stayed closed. What was clear, however, was that the decision by Canada to block free U.S. access to Alaska represented a watershed moment. It exposed the fragility of assumptions that had underpinned North American cooperation for decades. In a world where economic decisions can spark geopolitical aftershocks in an instant, even the most well-worn paths between neighbors can become fault lines. What else would you like to explore on this topic? As the standoff intensified, the disruption reverberated far beyond the physical blockade itself, threading itself into the fabric of international trade policy, intergovernmental dynamics, and the future of North American infrastructure planning. The closure of Canada's land corridors to Alaska, once viewed as an unthinkable measure in a globally connected era, forced both nations and the world to confront the reality of how quickly geopolitical certainty could collapse under the weight of unilateral action and retaliatory pride. At its heart, the move signaled the unraveling of long-standing norms of mutual reliance. For decades, the physical geography of North America, particularly the peculiar positioning of Alaska, disconnected from the continental U.S. save for the passage through Canadian land, necessitated a level of trust and cooperation that transcended short-term political fluctuations. That trust had been grounded in shared defense agreements, robust economic interdependence, and generations of peaceful coexistence. Its abrupt suspension raised deep questions about how future crises might be navigated when foundational understandings could be so easily set aside. The logistical adaptations triggered by Canada's blockade were vast and improvisational. The U.S. military, for instance, began reactivating lesser-used ports along the Pacific coastline and initiated supply missions via military transport aircraft typically reserved for overseas deployments. This repurposing of military logistics to solve civilian supply problems demonstrated just how brittle peacetime supply chains could become when diplomacy failed. The U.S. Navy began routing additional cargo to ports in Anchorage and Kodiak, while temporary depots were established on the Aleutian Islands as forward hubs to support the influx of redirected shipments. These workarounds, while impressive in scale and execution, were not sustainable. The cost of flying essential goods, construction materials, agricultural products, industrial equipment into Alaska was exponentially higher than traditional overland transport. This not only drove prices upward in Alaskan markets, but also disrupted inventory schedules and stalled economic activity, particularly in rural regions that were least equipped to deal with supply interruptions. With barge traffic limited by seasonal ice and unpredictable weather, even maritime alternatives offered only temporary relief. Economic modeling firms began releasing projections of the long-term impact should the standoff continue. One analysis suggested that even a 6-month continuation of restricted access could reduce Alaska's GDP by up to 8%, due in large part to halted infrastructure projects and contracting tourism revenue. This was more than just a disruption. It was a potential transformation of the Alaskan economy, with significant consequences for employment, investment, and migration patterns. These projections spurred action at the state level. Alaska's state government convened emergency legislative sessions to explore incentives for businesses willing to invest in alternative supply chain infrastructure. There was renewed interest in establishing direct maritime trade routes with East Asia, bypassing both the lower 48 states and Canadian routes altogether. While previously considered too costly or inefficient, these alternatives were now being re-examined with urgency. Some lawmakers even floated the idea of proposing new interstate compacts with Pacific port states to coordinate emergency shipping efforts and ensure resource allocation. Meanwhile, legal scholars and constitutional experts began dissecting the implications of the Canadian blockade under international law and cross-border agreements. Questions arose about whether the action violated existing transit treaties or bilateral understandings established during the Cold War. While Canada had technically retained sovereignty over its territory, the de facto closure of a critical logistical artery was viewed by many in Washington as an indirect act of coercion, a calculated attempt to bend U.S. policy through disruption rather than dialogue.